Bryan Kohberger just suffered a massive legal blow. A judge has officially ruled that key DNA evidence, including the knife sheath found at the crime scene, will be used against him in trial. This ruling is a game changer, and it could be what ultimately convicts him of the brutal murders of 4 University of Idaho students. But here's where it gets even crazier. Kohberger's defense fought hard to get this evidence thrown out, arguing it was obtained illegally. They claimed law enforcement violated his rights, that they used controversial DNA techniques, and that the entire case was built on flawed forensic science. But the judge, he didn't buy any of it. So what does this mean for the trial? Why did the judge say no to Kohberger's defense? And how does this ruling bring us one step closer to justice for the victims, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonsalves, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin? Today, we're breaking down everything. What was argued in court, the DNA evidence that prosecutors say ties Kohberger to the murders, and why this ruling could seal his fate. Stay with me, because we have all the latest updates straight from the courtroom, and trust me, you don't want to miss a single detail. Now that we know the judge has ruled against Kohberger's defense, let's talk about the actual evidence that prosecutors say directly connects him to the crime scene, because this is where things get really damning. But before we break this down, it's important to note this information comes from official reports, and we're watching closely to make sure everything holds up as the trial approaches. The most critical piece of evidence, a tan-colored K-bar knife sheath found near the bodies of 2 victims inside the house. But it wasn't just any knife sheath. On the button snap, investigators found a single male DNA sample, and that DNA, it led them straight to Bryan Kohberger. Think about this. This wasn't a random piece of evidence. A knife sheath is something personal, something that belongs to the killer. Prosecutors believe it was accidentally left at the crime scene, possibly during the attack. And because of that single mistake, investigators were able to track down their suspect. But here's the question. How did police take an unknown DNA sample and connect it back to Kohberger? They used a controversial but highly effective technique called investigative genetic genealogy. It's the same method that was used to catch the Golden State Killer decades after his crimes. They uploaded the unknown DNA into public ancestry databases, the same ones people use to find long-lost relatives. By building a family tree, they were able to narrow down possible suspects until they had one clear match, Bryan Kohberger. But they needed to be absolutely sure, so law enforcement trailed Kohberger as he left Pullman, Washington, and drove across the country to his parents' home in Monroe County, Pennsylvania. And that's when they made their next move, the trash pull. FBI agents collected discarded trash outside the Kohberger family home, carefully extracting any potential DNA samples. When they ran the tests, it was a near perfect match to the DNA found on the knife sheath. Prosecutors say this is irrefutable evidence. They argue that Kohberger's DNA should not have been anywhere near that house, let alone on an item left at the crime scene. They believe this sheath was left behind during the murders, and that, according to them, is all they need. Investigators also say Kohberger's cell phone data and surveillance footage further prove his connection to the crime. His phone was turned off during the time of the murders, a suspicious move considering he was frequently in the area before and after the attack. Now, here's another important piece of reported information. NBC's Dateline special, The Killings on King Road, revealed that Kohberger purchased a K-bar knife and sheath from Amazon in April 2022, 7 months before the murders. At that time, he was still studying for his master's degree in criminology at DeSales University in Pennsylvania. He graduated in June and then relocated across the country to Pullman, Washington to start his graduate program at Washington State University. According to the report, he took the knife with him when he moved. Now, this is a significant revelation. Was this the exact knife used in the attack? And if so, was it premeditated months in advance? If this DNA evidence is so strong, why did Kohberger's defense try so hard to get it thrown out? They claim the way law enforcement obtained this DNA was illegal, and they've been fighting to have it suppressed. But as we now know, the judge didn't agree. Up next, we'll break down Kohberger's defense strategy, what they argued in court, why they say this evidence shouldn't count, and how the prosecution shut them down. So we've broken down the key evidence, the BARKnife sheath, or the DNA match, and even Bryan Kohberger's Amazon purchase history. But here's the thing, none of this matters if the evidence gets thrown out, and that's exactly what his defense team tried to do. Bryan's legal team came out swinging, arguing that law enforcement violated his constitutional rights by the way they collected and tested his DNA. They filed multiple motions to suppress the evidence, saying the state used illegal methods to connect him to the crime. The defense's biggest argument, that the use of investigative genetic genealogy, where law enforcement ran an unknown DNA sample through public ancestry websites, was an invasion of privacy. They claimed this was essentially a warrantless search and that the police should have needed a judge's approval before running that DNA through private databases. They argued that if this evidence was illegally obtained, then everything that followed, including the trash pull and the cheek swab, should be thrown out too. And then there was the trash pull. Remember, police secretly collected garbage from outside Bryan's parents in Pennsylvania. The defense argued that this was an illegal seizure, saying he still had a reasonable expectation of privacy even in his trash. They claimed that if police hadn't pulled DNA from that garbage, they never would have had probable cause to arrest him in the first place. And if that arrest was based on unlawfully obtained evidence, then everything that followed should be tossed out. But it didn't stop there. Bryan's attorneys also fought to suppress digital evidence, including his AT&T phone records, Google searches, Amazon purchase history, and even his USB drive. Their argument, that law enforcement overstepped their authority when they subpoenaed these records without proper justification. They claimed the prosecution violated his Fourth Amendment rights by digging through his online activity. But after reviewing all these arguments, the judge made his decision, and it was a devastating blow for Bryan's defense. Every single motion was denied. The judge ruled that Bryan forfeited any expectation of privacy in his DNA the moment he left it behind on the knife sheath at the crime scene. In the ruling, the judge stated DNA found at a crime scene can be analyzed to identify an unknown suspect. There is no reasonable expectation of privacy in that scenario. Translation, if you leave behind DNA at a murder scene, law enforcement has every right to test it. As for the trash pull, the judge made it clear, once something is thrown away and placed outside, it is considered public property. Bryan's attorneys tried to argue that it was still his private DNA, but the judge wasn't buying it. He ruled that law enforcement acted lawfully when they collected the garbage and tested the DNA they found inside. And when it came to the phone records, purchase history, and digital data, the judge ruled that all of it was lawfully obtained through proper search warrants, meaning every subpoena and request followed the legal process. This ruling is a massive victory for the prosecution. It means that when the trial starts, they will be allowed to present all of this evidence in court, the DNA, the knife sheath, the cell phone records, the digital history, everything. And remember, the victims' families have been anxiously waiting for this moment. Kaylee's parents issued statements saying they are grateful the case is moving forward and that justice is just moments away. So what does this mean for Bryan? With all of this evidence now officially allowed in court, the stakes for his upcoming trial just skyrocketed. But here's the big question. Will the defense pivot? Will they change their strategy now that they've lost these motions? With the death penalty on the table, they have no room for error. Up next, we'll break down what's ahead for Bryan, including his upcoming trial date and what experts say his defense team might do next. Bryan Kohberger's trial is now officially set for August 11th, and with the judge's latest ruling, the prosecution has gained a major advantage. But what happens next? What moves will the defense make now that their attempt to suppress key evidence has failed? First, let's talk about what we can expect in the coming months. Right now, both sides are preparing for one of the most high-profile murder trials in recent history. The prosecution is expected to lean heavily on the DNA evidence, the digital records, and Kohberger's suspicious behavior both before and after the murders. On the other hand, the defense is left with limited options. Their primary strategy was to challenge the way law enforcement obtained DNA and other evidence, but with those motions denied, they now have to rethink their approach. One potential move, shifting their focus to questioning the integrity of the investigation itself. Kohberger's attorneys have already hinted that they may argue law enforcement rushed to judgment and that investigators had tunnel vision when they identified identified him as the suspect. They may also attempt to introduce alternative theories, possibly suggesting that DNA transfer or another suspect could have played a role in how his DNA ended up on the K-bar knife sheath. Then there's the jury selection process. This will be a critical moment in the case. Given the intense media coverage, finding jurors who are unbiased and haven't already formed an opinion about Kohberger's guilt or innocence will be challenging. If convicted, Kohberger faces the death penalty. The prosecution has already signaled that they will pursue it, and given the brutal nature of the crime, they will argue that this case meets the legal standards for capital punishment. But there's also a possibility that the defense could push for a plea deal to avoid the death penalty altogether. If Kohberger were to plead guilty, he could potentially receive a life sentence instead of facing execution. However, given the strength of the prosecution's case, they may not be willing to negotiate. Meanwhile, the families of the victims continue to wait for justice. Their parents have spoken out multiple times, calling for the trial to move forward as quickly as possible. As we get closer to the trial date, we will continue monitoring every development in this case. From pre-trial motions to potential surprises in court, this trial is shaping up to be one of the most closely watched in recent history. So, what do you think? Will the defense pivot to a new strategy? Will Kohberger take a plea deal? Or will this case go all the way to trial? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on all the latest developments in the case. My name is T-REV 757, and I am the voice for the voiceless.
Without me hearing his voice, I'm like, it's unconfirmed. But if you got friends that knew him and grew up with him saying it's confirmed, then I gotta say, hey, yeah, this is probably Bryan Kohberger.